You're listening to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy. Today we'll be talking to educator and author, Dr. Melissa Sadin. As part of our Dyslexia Awareness Month series, Melissa will share with us her personal story about how trauma and reading affected her family. She'll share how trauma gets in the way of the brain learning to read, what happens to children with trauma experiences, and how we as practitioners can help to heal trauma with instructional practices. Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast. Today, we are continuing our conversation about reading and trauma. I can't wait for this conversation. We started it previously with parents of dyslexic children and experts such as clinical psychologist Stephen Dykstra.
So we have Dr. Melissa Sadin with us today, and she is an educator. She has a doctorate in developmental trauma, which just sounds like, it's just so specific, and I love that, right? I'd love to dive so deeply into one area. But she has a book that we both read, Teacher's Guide to Trauma. So she's here to talk to us about how trauma can get in the way in the brain, like what actually happens in the brain when someone has trauma and how it can get in the way of learning how to read and what happens to children with these trauma experiences and how we can start to help children heal from these experiences. So that's what we'll jump into today. So welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you for your podcast. I think it's much needed, and I love talking about literacy any chance I get.
Yeah, well, we're so glad you're here today. Would you start by telling us a little bit about yourself before we jump into all of the really, really deep topics that we have on deck today?
So I was born in, no, I'm kidding. I always love to do that. Every once in a while I get a look on someone's face like she's not going back that far.
We don't have that much time.
Lifelong educator, special education, general education, building administrator, in and around. My mother was an educator, the best educator I've ever seen, and a literacy instructor. And so it's just been, it's who I am really. And then my husband and I, found our first son in a Bulgarian orphanage. He was 3 years old and we fell madly in love and we brought him home and started our family. And again, lots of understanding about child development. And my, first master's degree was in, behaviorally challenged children. I was doing that a lot when I was working as a special ed teacher. People warned me that he was going to struggle because he had spent 3 years in an orphanage, and I felt like I was uniquely qualified for that. And anybody who's ever raised kids knows that the first thing you find out is you know nothing. And worse, people were turning to me like I was the expert, and he was not. He was not doing things that children do, like the whole antecedent behavior stimulus and response was not following any kind of normal patterns at all. So that's really started my journey of what is this. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk wrote an article in 2005. Theo had been home for a few years then, and he said it was an editorial because, interestingly enough, back then, he couldn't get the Journal of Medicine to publish it. So he said, he's the guy who gave us the term post-traumatic stress disorder, by the way. So this is his field. And so he says there's this thing called developmental trauma, and children who have adverse childhood experiences, it's different than if something difficult happens to you as an adult, and it changes the way your brain grows. And then he went through, what these kids look like. And I still have that article. It's tattered. Because I printed it out, it was back in the day. And it changed my life because now I knew. I was like, this is my son. So then we spent, the next 20 years trying to find people who understood developmental trauma. We did, in fact, have the pleasure and the honor of working directly with Dr. Vanderkolk, who confirmed my suspicion that, he had developmental trauma. And so then, okay, now he has to go to school, right? And he has to be educated. And he had tremendous language delay, which we had, as soon as he could sit and interact, I had him in front of physical therapists, occupational therapists, and speech therapists. Some wonderful folks just helping develop what I now know was a unequally and developmentally delayed autonomic nervous system. He struggled to learn to read. And so, there were things that we had to do in addition to some fabulous Orton Gillingham approaches. And you should hear the boy read now. He's 24 years old and his fluency is just fantastic. But so I was a building assistant principal at that point, and I'm starting to look around at all the other children who are struggling to learn to read. And I'm starting to feel like, well, they weren't all from orphanages, for sure. It was a regular public school in central New Jersey. I was just like, no, there's a lot of similarities with some of these kids and Theo that were slightly different if you looked carefully than children who I knew were getting what they needed from, conception through their early childhood years. And so I started looking very closely at the connection between adverse childhood experiences and the development of the brain and how it impacts reading. And so that's really what I've spent the rest of my life on, is healing Theo and then teaching teachers. Very much like you both do, I felt like I had to share what I now understood that we're not being told still to this day. We're not being told in most pre-service teaching programs about the impact of trauma on the brain.
Would you mind to just, I love what you said about, you noticed that other students were having similar issues, but obviously they were not all adopted from an orphanage in Bulgaria. Can you talk a little bit about the, I don't know if this is the right term, but maybe the spectrum of what trauma is? How do you define that? What does it look like? Because, the orphanage is an extreme example of a traumatic event, right? But for other students in central New Jersey, it looks a lot different.
So, yeah, excellent question. Thank you. And it is a spectrum. We need to be able to use that word outside of folks who struggle with autism. It is a spectrum, and there's a lot of conversation about what the diagnosis will eventually be, because developmental trauma is still not in the book of diagnoses. And so right now we call it, the working title is developmental trauma disorder. But because one size fits one, it looks different on every child. You can have twins in a home who might not be getting consistent food or consistent shelter, or they have consistent shelter, but the attention, that loving connection that parents give their babies, where you just sit there. I sat there with Theo, but I also sat there with my second child, Noah, for hours, just staring at them and smiling and cooing and all of that stuff. And so we have children who might not be hurt by their primary caregivers, but might be denied that intense, long-lasting cooing and attention. It's called attachment. And so I did suspect that I had children there in central New Jersey who weren't getting the full dose, if you will, of those things. I knew some of the students in my school had shelter insecurity. I knew that some of them had food insecurity. I knew that some of them were being raised by mothers who had shelter and food insecurities when they were children. So I started to pay close attention to ACEs, right? Adverse Childhood Experiences, the study done by Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti in 1997. 20 years later, you can't ever count all the ACEs there are in the world. But the idea basically is children need us to stare at them. They need us to smile at them consistently. And they need us to do something when they cry. Now, I have to caution, there's a lot of wonderful parents out there who, like me, finally needed to shower. right? You're in the early months of it, and you're like, if I don't shower, I will lose my reason for going on in this life.
I've been there.
So you put the kid in the little bouncy seat on the floor in the bathroom, and you're singing the Barney songs while you're in the shower, and the kid screams through the whole thing. That is not traumatizing your child. But all of those other times that my children cried or needed something, there I was. I didn't always get it right, but what the child brain knows is that you're trying. Perfect parenting is trying. And so you just really have to try consistently to the best of your ability to figure out why they're crying. And the same thing when they're 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. And then you have to continue to try with your teenagers and push through the fact that they keep telling you that they don't need you and they know everything there is to know. And sometimes on good days, they hate you. So perfect parenting is just telling these kids that you're trying. And I knew that there were some parents, although trying, were not meeting the needs of their children in a regular way. And so these children who have these adverse experiences, which, by the way, can include racism and job bias and lack of access to quality schools or clean water, right? So there's a lot of other community-wide and environmental things that can impact the child getting what they need.
That is such a great point. And I would like to stamp, too, that we're just mentioning some causes of trauma. There are a whole host of others that we, could share that may be happening in your community, with children that in your classroom. So we're just sharing a few. But I'm really wondering right now, Melissa, what happens to children with trauma experiences? What happens in their body? What happens in their brain? How does this affect them as people?
Okay, so in order to get a full understanding of ACEs and how it impacts us all, I strongly recommend you go to the Trauma Foundation, or one word, .org. They have an 8-minute video that is the greatest thing out there right now. So if you have any more questions about all of those things I just mentioned, this little video is fabulous. But I will answer your question, Lori, by explaining that basically we have an autonomic nervous system. Part of that is the limbic system. And in our limbic system, the 3 major players in the limbic system are the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. And it's a complex system of switches, if you will, right? Of neurons that fire and don't fire back and forth. When there's trauma, whatever that trauma is, those things get impacted because the part of the brain, the amygdala, that's primary job is to keep us safe. We all have one, and it works until we die to keep us safe. That thing has to shut down other functions in order to do its job. So now if I'm a little baby and I'm hungry, so my amygdala fires, right? Oops, I'm hungry, which at that age, at 6 months old, if someone doesn't feed me, I'll die, is perfectly normal development, right? So what happens is the baby cries, signaling to another one of us that there's a need and it needs to be cared for. So in the case where I cry and cry and cry, but my mom is currently losing her ongoing battle with alcoholism, then the amygdala fires wildly, loudly, if you will. And when things fire together, they wire together. It is not a muscular situation, but if you think about using one arm more than the other, or weightlifting with only one arm for 3 years, obviously it's going to be much stronger and it'll be your go-to arm for all of your tasks. Well, so that's sort of what happens in the brain, is this survival brain becomes, in studies showing that it becomes larger by volume, actually, than a person who's getting what they need. So now what happens is I'm sitting in a 2nd grade classroom, and there's 2 cute little kids over there. They're all cute, by the way. These 2 are just as cute as all the others. And they're sitting there chatting with each other, and I'm sitting at my desk, but I suddenly perceive that they're laughing at me. And now I'm not safe. And now my amygdala floods my stress response system. And at that point, the hormone balance prevents the other parts of the brain that need to wire together for learning, for focus, for access to cognitive function. And so when that keeps happening, you really get a delayed development of our executive functions. And for those of you who aren't familiar, executive functions are really the mechanics of our brain that access our cognition and make it do things for us, like remember and organize and approach a task with perseverance. All of these things come from our executive function, which then is interrupted in its development. And that's why one size fits one, right? Because I've met kids who are extremely attentive to organization, who have had pretty significant trauma. Whereas my son, he's 24 now. So I label boxes, those refrigerator boxes, and put them in the fridge so that he can put things where they belong and find them again. Right. This is, he can't literally, he can't find his way out of a paper bag. He loves it. He knows it. He talks about Google Maps all the time. You know, Mom, Google Maps will get me out of this paper bag is what he says all the time. So, you know, similar traumas can still bring on very different brain performance. And so reading, as you both know, is extremely complex. And so all of these different parts of the brain, the hippocampus, which is in the midbrain and part of this autonomic nervous system, becomes greatly impacted by ongoing trauma. And that delays the executive functions, and the prefrontal cortex is a big part of reading as well. And as you know, tracking speed, but also processing speed in the brain, and memory, right? What does that word mean? Can I hold on to that word while I read these 5 other words in this sentence and pull them all together to make meaning out of the sentence? And any one of the parts of that can be impacted by trauma, or all of them. So we have kids who now that I perceive these 2 little kids might be making fun of me, even if they're just laughing, you know, at a little bug on their desk, right? My amygdala floods my stress response system. And it can cause me to tell you that reading is stupid, or throw my book on the floor, or do things that aren't at all connected because I'm not able to even access. You know, I'm actually afraid that I'm going to die. My brain's telling me that because I think these 2 friends of mine are making fun of me. There's absolutely no way that particularly a child in elementary school without extensive training by a developmental trauma therapist is going to be able to tell you that. I mean, 3rd graders can't tell you why they're mad most of the time anyway. So if you add trauma, then you delay self-understanding as well.
Melissa, is this that idea of fight or flight? Are the kiddos living in fight or flight mode?
Yes. There's actually 4 F words.
Yeah. Oh, 4 F words. Okay.
Freeze
fight,
is another
flight.
one, right?
There's
I don't know
4 because you can't have too many F words.
No.
So
maybe there's 5
and flight. Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. Yeah. There's that 5th one that has nothing to do with trauma, but is a word that we all love.
Yes.
There's freeze, there's fight, there's flight, and there's a large population and scientific community starting to add fawn, like little baby deer, fawn. I really call that one of the attachment styles. Little kids who are, they will morph into whatever you need them to be so that you will like them. You know, so and sometimes this is the 3rd grader that's trying to get on your lap, right? The big jump from 2nd to 3rd grade, but 3rd graders no longer sit on the teacher's lap. And very few 2nd graders do, but maybe at lunchtime when they're really sad, right? A 7-year-old. Okay. But by 3rd grade, you're as startled as the kid is when she's climbing into your lap. And that's a definite signal that she didn't get the psychological development of self that she needed. And her brain is still in the place where a little girl needs to crawl onto someone's lap. So, but what that will look like is that, actually I might excel at learning, but then I get one wrong and that amygdala fires, puts me in a flight or a fight response. And I'm unable to learn. And I might shut down completely, or I might storm out of the room. We have to understand that freeze, fight, flight, and fawn can happen simultaneously. They can happen quietly. That's the other thing. People always think, fight response is screaming, yelling, cursing, and running out of the room. The fight response is anybody moving toward their perceived threat. So that little girl back in the classroom where the two friends are talking and laughing, a fight response would be that I would move toward that threat. So maybe I'd walk over there and maybe I'd say mean things to them. Or maybe I'd throw something at them like a pencil, right? A flight response is I would move away from my perceived threat. And that's a very important word, right? That perceived threat. This is where teachers go, I don't know what happened. I was sitting there, Sally knows she's safe in my classroom. Well, okay, she does, except when her amygdala fires, and then it has nothing to do with you. So I could move away from the threat, which now might be back to that, reading is stupid. Now I'm looking for your attention any way I can get it. Or, maybe I need to go to the nurse, or maybe I jump up and run out of the room. Freeze is a hard one because freeze can look like a lack of focus. Kids who just stare off, they look like they're daydreaming, except if you ask them what they were thinking about, they don't have an answer because freeze is really kind of a shutting down of your essential systems because the brain has become so overwhelmed by these flooding hormones that the amygdala pushes out that they start to shut systems down. Falling asleep constantly in the middle of class, those are freeze responses. So yeah, there's 4 F words, and they are the things that any of us will do if our amygdala fires. But with kids with trauma, that amygdala is firing way more than it is for a child who got most of what they needed, from 0 to 8, 9, 10, 11 years old.
You just reminded me of so many memories of things happening in my classroom. And at the time you're same. I don't know what's happening here. And I was just thinking of one student. I'm not sure exactly where this falls. It might be kind of that fawn one because that's new to me. But every time there was an assignment, it didn't matter what it was, there was an immediate response from this student. And he would just hand up in the air, I need help. There was no even attempt to try, no matter what it was. And it reminded me of that fawn one. He wasn't climbing in my lap. This was 6th grade, but it was an immediate, I need help. I can't do anything unless I have you right next to me.
Right. And you find yourself saying, you haven't even given it a try.
Right.
Okay, so I have a great strategy for that. And this is good for all ages. But you're right, Melissa, you bring up a very good point. These things look very different based on their age. And the older they get, the more they're actually, they've gotten very good at covering up, right? Mm-hmm, so, when you say what's wrong with you to a 6th grader, they'll make something up in the absence of knowing, right? But you're right. It's all the same freeze, fight, or flight. It just does start to look different as we grow. So if you have kids who are, they raise their hand, maybe they're raising their hand and calling out, maybe they're not raising their hand at all. Miss Smith
probably
Miss
wasn't
Smith.
Always
right.
Yes.
I need you. And you're like, oh my gosh. And all the other kids are trying to work. And if you don't go over there, then she starts to interact with all the kids at her table. And, all heck is about to break loose. So timers.
It's like you were there.
See, I had all these kids. So for example, let's call him Doug. I need to come up with a name because otherwise the pronouns get very confusing. So Doug's in your class, Melissa, and this is what's going on. And you go over with a 30-second timer. And you say, Doug, I want you to put your name right here, and you highlight it. So there's a visual too. See this timer? Turn it over. I'm going to be back as soon as this timer is done. Because what happens is you go off to talk to other kids and you do get distracted and then you really don't come right back. So this child has a tremendous fear that you're going to leave them, like abandon them forever. That's what the brain is saying, even though, of course, that's not what's going to happen. There isn't logic in survival. Okay. So the child stares at the timer, and then you know what happens, right? What does Doug do the second the last grain of sand drops? It's done. It's done. It's done. So you go back over and you say, great, Doug, did you write your name? Sometimes, so the way this would start was, no, nothing's happened. He was staring at the timer the whole time. But what I started to notice, I had 30 seconds of peace and quiet. So then I say, okay, turn it back over 30 more seconds, but this time try to write your name. I mean, what happens is we get so freaked out. He has to write like a 3-paragraph essay, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, this is our 3rd minute into this, and he's now not writing his name. But you're building trust that you will help him. Once he trusts that you will help him, he will be able to hang in there until you can get back to help him. And then what starts to happen is, because now you're on the 2-minute timer, it could be 3 weeks later. Honestly, it could be 6 months. Hang in there, my friends. Everybody grows at their own rate. But now you, like, another teacher's like, how come Doug's so good in your class? And you're like, because Doug trusts me. And that's not a very easy thing for him to do. And so he and I have worked out when he really needs help and when he doesn't. And he sets the timer. And these little silly timers, you can do this with 5-year-olds, and you can do, I've done it in high school, because the timers are all over the classroom anyway, by the way. Get some timers because they're fabulous just to have all the classroom. Kids, when you say to kids, all right, you're going to work for 5 minutes. Yeah, they have nice timers on the smart boards now. That's helpful too, because our 5 minutes turns into 20. Then we feel like we're rushing. And it's really just because we got engaged with kids and lost track of time. So kids with timers, your classroom's going to run literally, no pun intended, like clockwork. But kids like Doug might be able to develop the ability to wait. That's what you want. The ability to
Melissa,
wait.
Let me ask you this. I'm thinking, are we using the timer? Are we using the timer for more than one purpose? Are we using the timer to regulate the response and also chunk the assignment?
Yes.
Like that's where, as you were talking, I was thinking this is multifunctional here. Okay. Just want to make sure
that's why I said everybody needs timers.
That.
And, as a principal, I was careful not to give people a whole lot of stuff unless they asked for it, because when I cleaned out my closet, every time I changed grades or schools, I would be like, I could fill an entire shopping cart. Here's all the stuff you gave me I didn't ask for. So I didn't use it, right? Because I didn't ask for it. So I, help teachers understand the myriad of ways that you can use timers. And then for a couple of weeks at faculty meetings, somebody would do a share. What's a way that you used a timer in the last, since our last meeting? And I did that for 6 months. So people could just hear all the different things that really clever people do with timers. And then if you asked me for timers, I gave them to you. So I had them in my office. By the way, they were behind my desk. So anybody who came into my office had to stare at them. So it was subliminal advertising as well. But yes, and clever teachers. Yeah. If you can work until this timer's over, right, then you can go do this thing and set another timer over there. Right. So for your kids who truly do have attention and focus issues, it helps. For kids who are triggered, just watching the sand is sometimes all that it needs to do. I've had kids go back to the place of peace. And I have a big one there that's, I have 30-minute and 20-minute and 10-minute timers back there. And kids will just turn the timer they think they're going to need to regain composure to go back to the lesson. So it helps them try to figure out what they need as well. Not every kid, my son Theo is a perfect example of he needed tactile regulation tools. I gave him a glitter wand one time because I was, fancy and going to get good at this regulation stuff. And he tried to hit me with it. So I was like, okay, not his tool. But he likes silicone sponges. I have one here, but I moved it recently. Silicone sponge, you can buy them at Walmart. They're supposed to be sponges. I don't find them very effective as sponges, but when your fingers interact with silicone sponges, serotonin gets released in your brain. Serotonin is the happy hormone, but it's also the hormone that blocks stress response hormones. So if you have serotonin flooding through your brain.
Oh my gosh, I need like 30 of them on my desk.
So first of all, my younger sister is in finance. And so, they're talking in the millions and billions of dollars daily. And she went to an exhibit with me. I go to conferences all the time. And she was fidgeting and moving around. So I handed a silicone sponge to her. And she's like, what do you want me to do with that? I said, nothing. I want you to touch it. So at the end of the day, she was like, can I have this? I'm like, yes, you can. And then, she put it down on her desk and found that she stopped interrupting people. She's very, very bright. So she gets to the answer 25 minutes before anybody else in the meeting. And people got mad at her, right? Because she was interrupting. And she is calmer because of that silicone sponge. But silly putty, the thing I like about silly putty and silicone sponges and therapeutic silly putty is the best because it's really thick, is that you can do that while you're thinking and working. And it all depends on what you need. So, we create regulation tools in our schools that are something I can do while I'm working, something maybe I'm too triggered and I need to go to the place of peace and do a puzzle, a Rubik's Cube. Right. And there's a good example of one size fits one, because if I use a Rubik's Cube, it's going out the window about 3 minutes in. And yet my son loves to do the Rubik's Cube when he's really angry. And of course, he solves them very quickly. And so I've gotten him like the multi-layered ones. He wants to get out of his headspace to calm down. That's what Rubik's Cubes and puzzles do. So there's so many things that we have. And giving these things to kids brings them back to the classroom. When you have them present, then the reading instruction might stick.
Yeah, I love that you just said that, because I think, sometimes either leaders or teachers see, oh, well, this student is standing in the back of the room, or the student has a quote toy at their desk, and it's not a toy. This is a regulation tool, and we're helping the student take that time that they need in a set time, right? You said set a timer. This is not an extended period of time. We're not talking about 25 minutes of your 1 hour literacy block or 2 hour literacy block. And the purpose is to teach students how to take deep breaths, how to use this tool and regulate so that they can re-enter and learn. And I remember when I taught fifth grade, I did this I loved having students be able to walk around. And I had a bin in the back of the room, and a little station, and they could take anything that they wanted from there, go back to their desks, and they could stand, they could sit, they could just hold it, use it. And it allowed them to be present. And once I started that in my classroom, it was a game changer. And I think now it's like catching on mainstream with the fidget tool. I don't know if they're called fidget tools. The fidget toys is what I'm trying to say. The puppets or the little intertwiny rings, there's one real annoying one that makes noise that looks like a tubey thing. Teachers, we don't want that one probably, but I'm picturing all of these great things that are out there now that teachers could use and fill the classroom with, so students could have this regulation support and get back into instruction.
So that leads me to one of my favorite things called the reading revelation. Yeah. And so any teacher can do everything you just described. There's a couple of things that challenge us or get in our way temporarily. The first one is our own expectations of what we and all of our students are going to get done in 45 minutes. And I don't know about you, but I taught, I'm not telling you how many years I taught, certainly way long enough to write a lesson plan that actually fit in the time that I had for that lesson. And it's so rarely happened. And yet I kept expecting myself to do it. And then expected the kids to. So I want to remind us all, because we all teach reading. One of my favorite things to do in an auditorium full of high school teachers, particularly, just because many of them would say, I don't teach reading. How many of you teach reading? And, a couple of the folks who work in the remedial reading and the literacy and language and literacy blocks would maybe raise their hands. And I would say to the, PE and health. So if kids can't read at grade level, that's not a problem in your section. And so I go on, and by the time I'm done, everybody's raising their hands and patting themselves on the back, and we're having a good time. And then I say, okay, so now I want to ask you, and this is the question I ask everybody I work with. When a student doesn't sound the word out properly, right? So instead of C-A-T, cat, they say Kate, right? They're putting a long A there. How many people in education would say, that's it. How many times have I told you this is cat? You need to leave my room. No one. The answer to that is no one. Sometimes I hold my breath, but I have never had a teacher raise their hand and say, I do that, right? Because we understand that we need to help these children grow their brains so that they can read. No question. We all know that. It's actually common sense, right? So why then, when I am sounding the word out and I get frustrated and start talking very quickly, or maybe little kids will I've seen 5-year-olds just jump up and start running circles around the room, apropos of nothing else. Mm-hmm. Or hoodie up and head down. My favorite was the 8th grader who, just because he knew it was a sticking point for me, would stick his headphones in his ears while he was looking at me. I used to dream about what I would do with those headphones. The point was these behaviors that block the kids' learning. Why then do all of a sudden we switch to, if you do that again, then you're going to lose points, or you're going to have to go see Mrs. So-and-so. Why don't we use the same step-by-step accepting approximation approach that we do with reading, that we do with whatever learning we're involved in? So, Lori, you mentioned earlier, they can do this for a couple of minutes. So I had a young lady who I was called to the classroom. I was working with the school. So the teacher says, all right, I have a student I need help with. So I go down and I watch, and, we'll call her Betsy. So Betsy was 7 years old, and Betsy would come in and disrupt the classroom mightily for about, a half an hour to an hour. And the poor teacher was exasperated, and Betsy would, involve other people, and it really was very frustrating. And then Betsy would go in the back of the room and fall sound asleep, where she would sleep if you left her, through lunch. And so we had a meeting after I did a few observations, and it was, people at the table saying, Betsy can't just keep sleeping. And I said, okay, what happens when we wake Betsy up? And so finally the teacher said very quietly at the table, when she's sleeping, I can actually educate the rest of the kids. Mm. So it doesn't mean it's okay for Betsy to sleep through 2nd grade. But then we started to dig. What's going on with Betsy? Where is her brain? Is she physically well? We invite the caregiver in, who shares a lot, bravely shares about the adverse experiences that Betsy has been exposed to. And the bottom line was that she wasn't sleeping at home. It wasn't a safe place. So we wrote a sleep plan for her. And it took 6 months, but by the end of the 6 months, she was taking a nap in the afternoon and was a much more effective student. She was no longer screaming around the room, because she knew at a certain period of time she was going to be able to go to sleep. Mm-hmm. And she finished 2nd grade very close to grade level with her literacy skills. Okay, so if we'd have just kept saying, but she needs to stay awake, instead of what does she need from us, mm-hmm. she possibly could have morphed into a very dangerous student in a few years.
Yeah.
It's accepting that approximation. It's the same thing we do with whatever we teach.
Right.
And yet when their behaviors interfere, then suddenly we're out and it's their responsibility.
Something that you brought up when you were talking about that made me think of something in your book you talk about is the shame cycle. Mm-hmm. And, I see it in some of those behaviors, right? Like the teacher kind of shaming the student for doing the behaviors that are wrong. But I also wanted to ask you, when I read about that in the book, was what about with reading, right? What about maybe not the shame from the teacher, right? Because you said teachers are much more supportive, but just generally that feeling of shame that students might feel if they are not reading or, where they should be for their grade level, and what happens with that? So talk all about shame.
So, yeah. Okay. So shame floods the system with that amygdala I was talking about. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that happens, it's a very deep, complicated psychiatric and psychological phenomenon, but the development of self, right? I'm worthy. I can have friends, and somebody likes me, right? All of this that starts like that and turns into, I'm worthy of love as we grow older. When that doesn't develop properly, the overwhelming feeling that we are terrible, we're no good, we can't do it, it's no good, it won't work.
Yeah.
The flooding of shame. So I want teachers to understand that children can be full of shame despite your best efforts to genuinely like them and care for them and trust them. And no, I've never met a teacher who got up in the morning to go to school and make kids feel ashamed.
No, me neither.
So what I want teachers to understand is sometimes the brain is going towards the shame anyway.
Right.
So when you say, do you have your work? Because that's your job to ask this kid privately if he has his work, and he doesn't, he's flooding himself with shame, even though you haven't done the whole, how many times have I told you? Ooh, that was when I had to give up. Oh, I used to do that all the time because I started teaching middle school. So, it was, how many times have I told you? I let that go from my vocabulary altogether. It really has helped my marriage a lot. My husband, I don't have to ask him how many times I've told him. The idea is that they are looking for reasons to not be good enough. And so I just kind of took it on the way Theo was teaching me. Just like so many good teachers, I refuse to let you feel bad about yourself. So again, pointing out to kids, not praise bombing. Praise bombing only makes them not trust you. Oh, you're so pretty. You look so fabulous. Don't do that. Most kids only think that means you really don't care about them. But when you say, look, you set the timer and you wrote, your first name. Look at you. You wrote your first name, and I came back when I said I would. Constantly pointing it out, because what happens is we're like, but you're in 6th grade and you should have, a paragraph and a half by now, like the rest of the kids.
Right.
If teachers could say to themselves, I'm never going to get to the paragraph and a half with him if I can't get him to sustain his belief in himself enough to write his name. So we need patience with the process, and ourselves. Grace in the space is what I call it. Nobody's perfect, and I have apologized to students probably more than I've complimented them. Wow, okay, I think I expected you to get farther than you did, and that's on me. But let me help you with this and that and the other thing. And I found that with kids with trauma, as I began to learn more about this, I began to work with more and more of them at different ages. After a couple of weeks of, you showing your vulnerability and laughing at yourself and accepting whatever it is that they give you, then the shame doesn't overwhelm them as often. But it's a big one. And we think shame is, that whole wagging of the finger and
right.
And yes, that does shame kids. And I hope we're not doing that. On a good day, none of us are treating children that way. But kids feel ashamed just because we've said, maybe next time you'll get that, and walked away, right? That's such a normal teacher's thing to say. Nice try, next time you'll get that. And the kid's like, that's it, I'm no good, I can't. So we have to meet them where they are. Just like we do with whatever reading level they're on, wherever they are. If they're in 5th grade right. and, they're just tapping out sentences, then we don't. We just say, okay. And when you treat kids that way, they start to accept. So if their reading level is 3 grade levels behind, particularly, as you move into the upper grades and middle school, they become acutely aware. As a person who taught in self-contained programs in middle school for a bunch of years, I just would say it out loud to the kids. I refuse to allow you to accept that. My classmates think I'm stupid. Okay, what are you going to do about that? but positive growth theory.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to work with you so that you believe you're not stupid. But
you talked to us.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, you talked to us too about keeping expectations high, right? So, you're saying just because they're reading below grade level doesn't mean you can't also have high expectations for them.
Yes. And it doesn't mean that you can't get frustrated or slightly angry. I hear my son Theo in my head all the time because he has trained with me and he's done, podcasts with me and stuff. And so now I just hear him being snarky in my head. And I hear Theo going, yeah, she can get angry. So the whole idea is, to be able to say, kids, I expect more from you because I know you're capable of more. And right now, my job is to help you see what you're able to do.
Yes.
Because you're the only one who doesn't believe in you. But I'm not giving up on you.
That's so powerful.
Right. And I have said that out loud and in so many other ways.
Yeah. And I think what resonates with me, Melissa, is it's that first step. For example, when you talk about helping the student have the perseverance to write their name, they cannot, you cannot expect them to write an essay if they won't pick up the pencil to write their name. And what I'm hearing you say that is really standing out to me is just the respect that you as an educator are giving to the student to build the relationship that's needed to move forward so that that essay does finally happen. I'm hearing the word, I'm seeing the word yet in my mind every time you're talking. I'm like, ... yet, right? It will happen. I believe you. I believe in you. I believe that you can do this. We're going to start here. And we're just not at the essay yet, but we will be.
Right.
I just love that. I think, and you're really teaching growth mindset.
And that's exactly it, Lori.
Yep.
Yes. Yes. There's a lot of science around growth mindset, and it's not grit. You should also throw that word away. Just because one size doesn't fit all. And even though my son Noah definitely needs to develop perseverance, even though he's a child without aces. Grit kind of sounds like, suck it up, buttercup. Mm-hmm. And we all have ability to overcome certain things and not others, and with or without trauma. So your entire class needs a positive growth mindset. And that's really, I can do this. And there's lots of it. First of all, you can Google growth mindset. Carol Dweck has a lot of stuff out there. Basically, goal setting. You'd be amazed. I've met with 5th grade kids with trauma. And when you ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? I've still had some of them, who haven't passed science in 4 years say they want to be an astronaut. That's 5-year-old kind of magical thinking. Mm. That's a good sign that they are developmentally delayed in their limbic system somewhere. Not that we need to diagnose kids, but if 5th graders have magical thinking like that, they're not liars. That's where their brain is. So what I did was, because I like to help my teachers get to all of this without giving them 86 different separate programs that cost $100 million. So I said to my teachers, how about if we ask every student in the school, and we split them all up, especially when you get to middle school, everybody got 25 kids and they had 7 months to get through their list. And we sat down with every one of those kids and asked them, and they made fun of me by naming it wishes and fishes eventually. I had this really clever, long name. And so wishes and fishes is every single student, every single year needs to be asked, what is it that you do really well? What is it that you'd like to do better? And what do you want to be when you grow up? No one. My sophomore year in high school, actually, I think it was junior year. My English teacher, that was the year that we were writing big thesis papers. And I wrote a paper on family abuse, like women who are battered by their partners. She's like, what a harbinger. I had no idea. So it was so powerful. The research moved me, and she was so amazed by the quality of my work. And so she started meeting with me, and, she finally said to me, Melissa, what do you want to do next? And, I, of course, wanted to, I was a world-class equestrian. And so I told her that, and she had no idea. And then I realized that not a single teacher that I'd ever had up until junior year in high school knew that I even rode horses. We have a lot of kids. We have a lot of work that needs to be done. But every single child needs to ask themselves, what do I do well? Because the first time we did this in my school, I crunched the numbers. I had everybody put their answers into a program, like an Excel program, so I could get numbers. We didn't do that every year, but the first year we did. And it was something like 68% of my K-8 students couldn't tell you one thing they did well. 68%.
Wow.
Yeah, right? Like,
That's a lot.
And like some kids were like, I'm a really good skier. And teacher would be like, have you ever skied before? No, but I'm really good at it, online or in this game. So what started to happen we've done it for 5 years now, is that number changed dramatically the second year because the kids were ready for it. And now what they do is they collect what I want to be when I grow up, and they give it to kids when they leave our school in 8th grade to go to high school. So they have this, 9-year look back on what they want to be when they grow up, because it's funny, right? It goes all over the place. I'm going to be a ballerina. I'm going to be a fireman. I'm going to be, all the same kid. But it's connection, and connection builds safety, and safety helps reduce shame. And all of those things need to occur before we can learn to read, regardless of the fabulous reading program we're using.
Yes. I am actually on page 60 of your book, Melissa. And it is be curious about me. Ask me about what I like and what I'm interested in. And I'm loving this sentence here, or two sentences here. We can understand why being curious about kids with trauma is helpful. We are developing relationships. We are modeling the dance of attachment, showing them how to care about others. And that to me is what you're saying. Really model that and be that for the child or the children. And then they can come back and learn from you in not just learning how to read, but in learning how to develop relationships and to work through that trauma that they may have experienced.
The single most important thing we can do is make sure that every single student that walks through a public school or a private school, or any school, honestly, feels connected to at least one person in that school. And then we need to teach them to read. Because
that's really important.
Everything else falls from, I need one safe person. And some of us work in school districts where we know that the only safety the child has is in our school.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you who work in very high income school districts, I offer to you that trauma knows no socioeconomic boundaries. It might look different in 5-bedroom homes, but it's just as prevalent.
I think that we have ideas of where trauma lives, and I think it lives everywhere. And I think that's very clear from the state of the world that we're living in now. So thank you for naming that. Melissa, I want to make sure that we have a few moments to close out the podcast. And so we're going to do a couple rapid fire questions. All right. The first one is, what do you love to read?
Everything. Mostly I read historic fiction, but I read trade books as well.
Awesome. What do you love to watch?
Oh, Big Bang Theory is my guilty pleasure. But I'm making my way through a number of different shows. I found Dark Winds, so I'll do like the sci-fi thing. I'm a closet Star Trek fan.
Why closet?
Yeah, I don't because I've never been to a convention, I guess, and dressed up
Okay.
as Leonard Nimoy, but I'm one step away from that.
That is fun. What do you love to listen to?
Bruce Springsteen. I'm a Jersey girl, absolutely. But also, I spent a lot of time around horses and truly cowboys and cowgirls, so I have a great love of country music as well.
Nice. I'm a Jersey girl too, so I totally get that. What is a memory that you love as a teacher or an educator or as a student?
I have two that I'll share. The first one is as a teacher working with a student who was very hurt over a long period of time by the people who should have been caring for him. And he was a challenge, and I was his person. He didn't really pick that, but I was the only one not as afraid of him as everybody else was. And I wouldn't give up on him. And at 8th grade graduation, which he invited me to, it was a very small private school that he had gone to. And so they all got a chance to say a few things. And so he said, basically some version of the fact that I gave him his life back. And I think that so many teachers have given so many kids their life back. And that just happened to be an opportunity for this student to say that to me. And so that just was a moment in time that culminated why I'm in this business. And then the additional one was as a building principal. I was working with a teacher, and once again, it's a recurring theme with me. She didn't really like me because I knew she was so much more capable than she seemed to know she was. And so I was moving things around like you do in the summer, and I changed her teaching assignment by 2 grade levels. And she threatened to quit, and New Jersey is a union state, so she grieved me to the Board of Education, which of course it was my right to move her wherever I wanted. But I kept saying to her, I want you to understand that I'm doing this for you, not to you. And that I think you will find that you have so much to give, and maybe this grade level is a place where you can find it. And she did. And I was right. And that's not the moral of the story. The moral story is now she's teaching teachers, and she loves to tell the story of how much she didn't like me. And yet, that there's lessons to be learned. And we are, friends who communicate frequently. We don't live anywhere near each other, but I guess she likes me now. But that was such a moment as an educator, as an educational leader, to battle through with an educator I greatly respected, to help her really find her true calling.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great moral too. Like there's things that happen in life that are out of our control, whether it be personally or professionally. And usually those things help us to grow stronger. It's just really hard to see that in that moment. So I'm happy to hear it had a happy ending.
Agreed.
Okay. I have one final question for you. Why do you do what you love for education, for literacy, for, I would say, honestly, all of the children who are benefiting from teachers learning about trauma?
Because of that moment when I was home alone with Theo, and he had just destroyed the living room again, and I had no idea where to turn. And I had already tried turning to my peer group of fellow mothers who didn't really know how to manage me. It's kind of like, well, what's wrong with you that Theo keeps behaving like this? And it was a very, very dark time for me. And then I found the Attachment and Trauma Network. And I will call her out by name because she deserves it. Julie Beam, who is the executive director of the Attachment and Trauma Network. And I found them on Facebook and was really just trying to get some help for my son and for me. And she said to me, all you have to do is love him and let us love you. And I thought, for the rest of my life, I think I was driven by overcoming obstacles and then turning around and lifting, putting my hand down to help other people overcome their obstacles the way this organization and Julie Beam did for me. Because I don't know where Theo and my marriage, right? There's a lot there. I don't know where I would be if somebody hadn't just said, we got you. And no matter what happens, no matter what Theo does, it's not because you're a bad person or a bad mother.
Yeah. I think not blaming the person who is, nobody wants their child to be doing that, right? Or children in our classrooms to be dysregulated so much that they are, they're acting the way that doesn't feel good. And I'm sure it doesn't feel good for them. It doesn't feel good for us, but it's not helpful to blame. It's not helpful to blame the teacher. It's not helpful to blame the student. I love what you shared earlier about the story of helping that student set aside a time to take a nap, because that made all the difference in her day. And I think that just brings me back to the word that really resonated this entire podcast, and that's respect. So thank you so much for being here and for helping us to see how being respectful looks, in many different ways for many different people. And it really depends on meeting their needs. So thank you for helping us see that today. And we are so grateful that you took so much time to spend with us and to talk with us about this. Thanks for listening, literacy lovers. To stay connected with us, sign up for our email list at literacypodcast.com.
And to keep learning together, join the Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast Facebook group. And be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter.
If this episode resonated with you, take a moment to share with a teacher friend or leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Just a quick reminder that the views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests of the Melissa and Lori Love Literacy podcast are not necessarily the opinions of Great Minds PBC or its employees.
We appreciate you so much, and we're so glad you're here to learn with us.